everybody for joining us for another Brewseum virtual event. I'm Liz with the Brewseum. We've been doing this since mid-March, a couple times a week, and we're going to keep on keeping on. Thanks to you guys showing up, so appreciate that. Very, just humbled and honored that we have such a great team with the Brewseum. We have a great board of directors, a national advisory board. We have our League of Historians, and Travis is on our national advisory board, and everyone has been more than willing to bring their knowledge and expertise to you via these events for the Brewseum. So I'm pumped about this. I'm really pumped about this talk because 18th century United States history has a special place in my heart. I went to graduate school in Boston and fell in love with that time period and sort of that aspect of tavern history and culture in the United States. So I'm pretty excited about Travis's talk today and his beer. Again, share what you're drinking if you want via the chat room. That's the spot to share information and communicate with one another as you would as usual. We're going to make sure everyone is muted when we get started, but the chat room is also the same place to ask questions of Travis, and we will get to those after he's wrapped up, and that's kind of it. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and hide myself and hand it on over to Travis.
Well, thank you, Liz, and I think this should all work. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so if you could confirm for me that you can see it once I get this kicked over, and I will open up my PowerPoint here and we'll get started.
Yep, we can see that.
So beautiful. All right, guys. Well, let's go ahead and get going. Thank you, everybody, for coming out again. I know some of you were on my, we're here for the talk I gave last month on Nestor's Cup, the ancient Mycenaean beer. And I'm really honored and excited to continue this program, this project. Liz said, we've known each other for a couple of years now, and now being a member of the Chicago Brews team, we have a really awesome opportunity here to continue this beer history and spread this knowledge and hopefully get more people interested and curious about the topic. And so after last month, where I really got to dive into a topic that is certainly very much up my alley, when Lucas and Liz reached back out to me and said, would you like to do another one this month? I said, sure, but let's switch gears big time, because I think especially in the academic world, I'm known as a classicist, but much like Liz, 17th and 18th, even 18th century American history has become of great interest to me. It's almost become kind of a pet project. And what I found myself doing over the last couple of years, pretty intense on the top and great interest for it. Afternoon, hope to do here during our Happy Friday, right? So hopefully everybody's got a beverage cracked open. And I'm certainly going to be drinking one while we get through this. Talk a little bit about, as I've titled this talk, Booze and Beer with George Washington, because certainly I want to talk quite a bit about beer, but as I've discussed, what I find very fascinating about George Washington is history in the early periods of his time in the Americas, even more as the general and the military man, all the way up through the presidency, is that alcohol kind of played an interesting role in his life. And the way I often put it is kind of struggle with it. And when I say that, obviously, modern perspective, the idea is that he struggled with alcohol personally, that he was an alcoholic or something like that. That is not what I mean when I that or struggled to exit amongst his troops and amongst the people that he worked with. And what is really quite is this talk today, he only got to experiment really with alcohol production for a very brief window. He dies early in retirement. I'll talk. You can reach out to me at the end of this talk today, but those are my 2 email addresses. And just to give those of you who don't know me a little bit of background on me, and I know some of you saw a month ago, I am a brewer at Avery Brewing Company in Boulder, Colorado. I'm also a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so the various titles that I hold, my actual title at Avery is Innovation Wood Cellar Manager, meaning that I oversee all new brand development and the barrel program for Avery. But I also have been given the title the Beer Archaeologist, and that has to do with the logo you see on the left-hand side of the screen. In 2016, I started a series called the Ales of Antiquity series, where I spend the vast majority of my life researching ancient alcohol and historic alcohol, and then trying to recreate it to some degree, or at least try to resurrect the processes in a modern setting. And luckily at Avery, I have the ability to do that, and they kind of give me free reign to work on what I want to work on. So that's what I do at Avery. And then at the University of Colorado, I'm a class anthropology and incoming teaching mechanical engineering for their graduate program, teaching brewing and brewing science. But as a classics professor, that means I typically live in the ancient world. So I teach anything Greek, Roman, or Egyptian primarily. But it's kind of interesting. I'm full-time at both locations. So most of my day, my day job is being a brewer. And actually, I just got, as my wife was joking, I have quarantine locks going on, if you can't tell on the camera, because, you know, it's hard to get these days. So I apologize for my atrocious hair today, because I was wearing a hat all day, barreling our beer Night Warden. Our next batch will be coming out in September. In our barrel program, at any given time, it fluctuates. It's at our peak, we're at about 4,000, 4,500 oak barrels that we have. But with the Ales of Antiquity series, over the last several years, we've done several of them. Ancient Mycenaean beer called Nestor's Cup. Many of you talk about last. Egyptian, Viking, and ancient Chicha beer that next in the series. I spent some time with natural 18 historic. Did Sea Scroll 20, I think that was 2017 as well. And then since then, what's been really fun is the program has gained quite a bit of attention. And so we now can these beers, and the last three that I have released, they are obviously very limited. Part of it has to do with the cost. They are quite expensive, dealing with very strict ingredients. It's very manual processes to recreate these beers. But the last three we did were George Washington 1752 India Pale Ale and Monticello. I'll actually talk about 1752 IPA and Monticello at the very end today, because I'm doing a talk on those next week. So if people are interested, you can certainly hit me up, and I'll share that information at the end today. But George Washington is why we're all here. And as I said, what's fun about this project is when I started the Antiquity series in 2016, I obviously do most of my research and spend a lot of time in Europe working on ancient European beers. But as the program got bigger, it was kind of comical. Our sales and marketing team at Avery came to me and they said, look, we're thinking about putting these into a package that's a bit more accessible to the public, albeit limited, but for the love of God, can you make something American? That's what they said, because obviously some of these weird things I do, a lot of people have never even heard of the cultures that I was looking into. And so I said, sure, I would be happy to do so. I actually had thought about back in 2016 is when I started the series. I had originally started a side project on a presidential series that I wanted to do. And what is we've kind of won the presidential series into the overall Ales of Antiquity project. And so what I did was quite a bit of time trying to go to himself. Too much information, as you can tell here, from my various trips out to Virginia and to Washington, D.C., spent some time in Boston, New York as well, Connecticut, doing research. This from George Washington University, where my wife graduated. Actually, we went back there for her to go back to her alma mater for the first time in several years, and I couldn't resist with this photo op. But as I dig into it, I thought the best way to really approach this topic in the time we have is to give a little bit of background on George Washington and talk about, as I said, this seeming struggle that he had with alcohol throughout his life. And I'm not saying that he was an alcoholic by any means. I'm saying with how to deal with it in a general kind of cultural context for him to live and with very individuals. Now, to start the whole story off, to kick things off, this is where the story of the Washington family begins. George Washington, obviously born in the Americas, in the colonial, in the colonial phase of American expansion. But these estuaries of the Chesapeake Bay is actually where his forefathers made landfall. John Washington of the Washington family or clan was the first to make landfall in the early colony coming over from England in 1656. Now, G.W. himself, he wasn't born until February 22nd of 1731. So it's why we celebrate President's Day every year when we do. And as a matter of fact, I released George Washington Porter on President's Day in 2019. So just about a year ago. The reason it fluctuates, though, the actual date, we don't always celebrate on February 22nd, as President's Day is always on a Monday. So it's the week of his birthday is when we celebrate it. But nonetheless, he was born at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was a fourth-generation American at that point. His father, Augustine, was a twice married man, and George was born 1 year into the second marriage of his life with Mary Ball. After that, they would go on to have 5 more siblings. Shortly, and I should say after he was born there, they shortly thereafter established an estate at Little Hunting Creek, and I'll come back to these. These estates are important to the history of GW, as we'll see in a bit. And then also, George later moved to a different farm being built by his father on the Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg, Virginia, 1730. In 1743, George Washington, George Washington's father, that is, Augustine Washington Sr., passed away, and he left Little Hunting Creek to Washington's half-brother, Lawrence. It was not given to George Washington originally. Important, it will become the famous, today, as I'll discuss in a moment. Westmoreland County Plantation was not willed to George Washington either. It was willed to his half-brother, Augustine Jr. So kind of as his life went on in his early years, he kind of thrived between the two estates after his father passed away. He spent time at both Little Hunting Creek. He also spent some time at Rappahannock. Now, Little Hunting Ranch, or Little Hunting Ranch that we discussed before, would later be renamed Vernon. And it was named Mount Vernon in honor of Admiral Edward Vernon, who had fought in the War of Jenkins' Ear in the nearby vicinity. And to pay homage to Vernon, who was affiliated with the family, they renamed the location Mount Vernon. Rappahannock then was eventually given to George Washington, and it's where it was much more modest. You can see the reconstruction of it here on the right-hand side. And it's where his mother and his siblings would live for a period of time. Until George Washington became more famous and started appropriating more property. So what's interesting is that George did not originally own Mount Vernon. It was his brother who owned Little Hunting Creek, or Mount Vernon. Now, for young George, he had to figure out a way, though, to make a name for himself for various reasons, as we'll see. When it came to families at this time, the Washington family was wealthy. They would have been considered exceedingly wealthy with the amount of land that they owned. But what's really quite interesting is even owning multiple farms in the estates that they did in the Virginias, they didn't even crack the top 20 list of the wealthiest landowners in the Virginia colonies at that time. So George was trying to figure out a way to make kind of a claim to fame for himself. And what he started to do was survey. So literally going out, surveying territory and property and topography in an attempt to help the sale of this property. Now, surveying would be critical for his later expansion of the Mount Vernon estate when he would eventually take ownership of it. But in the early phases, again, he's just a boy here. He's trying to kind of make a name for himself. Eventually, what would happen was that he expanded Mount Vernon well beyond what his father could have ever fathomed it would have been. This map here you see is from 1793. And it's constituted by 5 farms that eventually he owned and completely brought within the umbrella of Washingtonian ownership. He continued his job as a surveyor. He specifically worked with a man by the name of Lord Fairfax, and who was a huge landowner in the area in Culpeper County. And he becomes extremely familiar with the rugged backcountry terrain of Virginia. And this was really, really important for his later career in the military. By 1751, he becomes one of the best land speculators in Virginia, which really allowed him to fame in a very different way than probably most of us think of George Washington. Also for him, very luckily, considering the time frame, he had survived smallpox. He had it as a child, and he got through it, and he flourished physically to the extent that one of the commonly told stories about George Washington was his stature. He was 6'6" tall, so 6'6". That's a big boy back then. It is today, and even bigger back then. Most accounts of George put him as very notably athletic and quite strapping. This was really important for George, and honestly, a lot of misfortune allowed him to step into the position that he would later be in, because his elder brother Lawrence, who remember was the owner of Mount Vernon, was less fortunate with smallpox and died in 1752. Now, this was hugely impactful upon George Washington because GW was false. Now he no longer had the older brother looked up to for so many years. As a result, George was struggling a little bit, but he tried to get hold of Vernon once again. And so he started leasing all of this territory from Lawrence's widow, Anne Fairfax, at this time. Now, again, this map is from 1790. This would be very in George Washington's life. He dies in 1799. So this is well into his years that it gets to this, but he was already starting to expand at this time as he was leasing territory. Now, why was he leasing property? One of the things he really wanted to get his hands on was tobacco production. This area in Virginia was well known for flourishing with tobacco, so he was hoping to propagate a lot of that here. They still grow tobacco there at Mount Vernon to show the ways of the past of the estate. So this is the harvest from 2018 that you see here when my wife and I are going out there, able to get some images of it when they were harvesting tobacco in 2018. But eventually his military career will begin and take off. And George had loftier goals than just farming at this point. And undoubtedly, he was also probably quite disappointed.
Hey, Travis, I don't know if you can hear me. It's Liz, but we've completely lost your audio.
Okay. Am I back, guys? Yep. Sorry about that.
Yeah, you're back.
I apologize. Let me kick back off here. I'm used to dealing because I teach through these. So let me go ahead and start it back up. Did you guys see this slide at all?
Yeah, we can.
Was I on this slide when I? Perfect. All right, let me keep it. Excellent. So George, like, he had lots of goals than just being a farmer. And as I was saying before, if you hear this, he was disappointed and embarrassed by his lack of education. He had he didn't know any foreign languages, which was completely contrary, really, to a lot of years of time. So kind of to seek out other ways to gain fame or to claim fame for himself. What he sought to do was get involved in the military. So the Virginia governor appointed George Washington to take his brother's position in the military. A lot of this had to do with his exceptional ability to survey. And so he was put in charge of training northern districts of the militiamen at that time. Now, during this, and this is talking about alcohol, like I said, I wanted to give you this whole background because I just think it's interesting to see how he builds into this position. Once he finally gets involved in the military, in 1753, he was sent to investigate French encroachment into British territory in the Ohio Valley. So basically, he is sent on an espionage expedition, right? And upon arrival at the French Fort Le Boeuf, Washington, Christopher Gist, you see here, and a man by the name of Van Braam were brought into the French camp, and they didn't really know necessarily that they were there to run reconnaissance on them, but they were wined and dined by the French. And we hear, as Washington later would state, that, quote, the French officers drank copiously, and this was all while Washington, quote, held back and tracked the conversation. And it seems early on that he knew that alcohol could be manipulated to a means, means to an end, at least for his, what he was trying to achieve militarily. And this will be the last time we hear this. We'll hear a lot more to come in a bit on his reluctance to imbibe, especially with other people, with other military individuals, not only obviously the French, who were the foe at this point, but also basically even with his own generals and things moving forward, or his own commanders. Now, in 1754, George Washington was later then put in charge of the Virginia Regiment to oppose the French. And within those instances, too, we hear of some interesting stories. In 1754, for example, the French and Indian War, when it breaks out, Washington was supposedly the one who delivered the first shot, causing the 7 Years' War as well from 1754 to 1763. So it seems that even outside of the alcohol and the story of beer and booze, he certainly had a huge impact historically. It's obviously quite disputed also whether or not Washington had any delivery shot in Indian. Back to the alcohol aspect, what I find so fascinating about the history of GW at this time is not only his reluctance in imbibing with others and the foe, but also what is starting to churn and burn internally for the militiamen and for these individuals that are essentially being commissioned and paid by the British government to fight their wars for them. Now, what's a very famous individual, Governor Dinwiddie, who Washington regularly corresponded with during this time. Interestingly enough, GW sent this letter that you see here off to Dinwiddie on March 7th of 1754. And essentially, the letter goes on, and you can take a screenshot or read it. If you can read the calligraphy, sometimes it's a little difficult to get through. But basically, to shrink it down into one sentence, he was pissed off about the unfair treatment and compensation of Virginia militia, his command. He had noted on multiple accounts that the British soldiers were being treated much better. As he says, giving up my commission is quite contrary to my intention, but let me serve voluntarily. Then I will, with greatest pleasure in life, devote my series to the expedition without any other reward than the satisfaction of serving my country. But to be slaving dangerously for the shadow of pay through woods, rocks, and mountains, I would rather prefer the great toil of daily laborer and dig for a maintenance than serve upon such ignoble terms. For I really do not see why the lives of His Majesty's subjects in Virginia should be of less value than of those in other parts of his American dominions, especially when it is known that we must undergo double their hardship. Now, what's interesting about this letter is you'll notice that in this caption, and actually in the entirety of the letter, he never mentions alcohol. But instead what he did was, when he sent it to Governor Dinwiddie, he included a whole bunch of other letters from his men. And interestingly enough, if you tally the things that they discuss that they're not happy about in these letters, they mention They're not happy that they're not happy about their infrastructure. They need more sergeants and corporals. They also say they need funds to buy better food, and right up there in the top 3 most mentioned gripes, get to and wine. I found that really, really quite fascinating. So I started looking into exactly what the rations were, and the daily rations for a British soldier were this. During these early years, you could get this amount of bread and flour, meat, pork, butter, so on and so forth. The volumes would be finagled when out of one item to compensate, but the Brits also got a quarter rum per 6 men, unlimited distribution of beer. And the militiamen were not getting that, and they weren't very happy with it. Now, in regards to George Washington on booze and whether or not he was completely anti-alcohol all the time, no, of course, all the time. For example, there were times where it seems to have been necessary. It's certainly interesting that George Washington himself doesn't mention the beer and wine, but includes complaints of others. And also, he will go on to be much more open and accepting of when drinking is needed in dire situations. For example, the Bill of Fort necessity. This is the reconstructed battle. This is the reconstructed battle, or I should say, fort. The reconstructed fort necessity. On July 3rd, 1754, this fort was surrounded, and basically everybody thought they were going to die. And as darkness fell, desperate men broke into the rum casks and lurched about drunk. Washington's own servant took a French musket ball and fell lethally wounded. And it's interesting, instances like this are things that Washington, in a lot of his letters, he seems to struggle with. He knew there's a death sentence to be involved in this battle, and so why not let them have that last drink? At the same time, there will be instances where this can come back to bite him in the butt pretty good, in instances where they could turn the tide and take back over, and he maybe was a little too loose in his willingness to allow individuals to drink. Now, on happier tidings, George Washington would marry Martha Dandridge Custis on January 6th of 1759, and shortly thereafter, he became the outright owner of Mount Vernon, because Anne Fairfax Washington passed away, and he became the estate trustee, so he took over Mount Vernon at that time. It is at this time as well, now that he owns a large portion of property, that his career is really going to take off. He originally included in the House of Burgesses in 1758. He was appointed in Fairfax County landowners for 16 years, and he was a delegate to the First Continental Congress in 1774. But of course, we know that there has to be a fracture there. He can't be involved in the House of Burgesses and a delegate to the First Continental Congress without some conflict somewhere in the intermediary. And it was certainly something that hits very closely home to beer and alcohol. We know that in the early First Continental Congress, this group would regularly meet at Colonial Williamsburg. If you haven't been there, highly recommend it. It's a strapping good time to go check out the location. Frank Clark is also a member of our team with the Chicago Museum, and it's really, he does a really nice job there. He's in costume all day, brewing in 17th century garb and 17th and 18th century styles. But they started to meet at this location, Raleigh Tavern in Colonial Williamsburg, to discuss non-importation agreement. And this non-importation agreement had to do with the fact that they were disgruntled with the House of Burgesses. And they were handing down a lot of legislation that they're handing down. They said, well, then let's stop bringing stuff in from England. Now, one of the things that they didn't necessarily think through, if they're going to stop that, is beer. And here you can see me sucking down a nice cold one here at Raleigh Tavern last time I was out there. But part of it was that there was not a whole lot of beer culture in the Americas at this time. I'm not saying people didn't drink beer or make it, but it wasn't a big money maker. A lot of it was being imported. Early America thrived off of rum that was also imported. And most other things that would come after that were spirits, because you get a lot more bang for your buck, basically, and they weren't being as closely regulated, although that will change, as we'll see here momentarily in the history. Now, at the same time as they stopped, or I shouldn't say at the same time, but around the same time, about 14 years prior to them stopping importing British goods, there were problems churning in England as well. Britain would win the 7 Years' War, and because of advanced financial institutions and abundant investments in capital gains, and it allowed the government to raise more money than could the French and Spanish. But by 1763, mounting taxes and national debt became alarming, and the Britons grew especially upset in 1760 when Parliament levied higher taxes on beer in England. So now, not only is there a high tax on beer within England, but that tax has to be carried on into the Americas or into the colonies at that time, and people were over it. The First Continental Congress didn't want to pay these taxes on this imported good. More on that in just a little bit. Now, the Revolutionary War breaks out on April 19th, 1775, following those first shots that were fired at Lexington and Concord. And George Washington traveled then to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress meeting. Excuse me. The first order at that time was, as he put it, to mold undisciplined and untrained militia into a professional army. When he did this, it meant he had to abandon his dear Mount Vernon. He would not see Mount Vernon again for 6 years. So he wouldn't return to his own home until 1781. Now, what he goes on to achieve after that is quite phenomenal. By June, he's commander-in-chief of the military. And by July 2nd, in 1775, he is positioned at Cambridge headquarters. Cambridge headquarters is where he would rear these soldiers to be more disciplined and train them. Here, a map showing that from the region just outside of Boston town. But even within the camp at Cambridge and amidst all the training, there was a problem with alcohol. With the possible exception of gambling, no moral failing made Washington more apoplectic than alcohol abuse. And that's a quote directly from Ron Chernow's biography of George Washington. He goes on to say, and I paraphrase, that just as he had faulted Mount Vernon employees for excessive drinking, he grew vigilant about bibulous generals. In a memorandum on general officers that he drew up as president, he recorded the demerits of each general and in most every case on his drinking habits. And so it seems that drinking was of great concern. And it was of great concern because it will cause a lot of problem for him. He tried to accomplish things militarily. He knew, obviously, that drinking lifted the spirits of the troops. But it was really quite hard to keep anything of this matter in control. For example, taverns could make a lot off of their military customers. And so though he might say, don't let them drink too much, the tavern owners are going to give them as much alcohol as they want because they're making money off of it. In turn, Washington sentenced a milieu of lushes to those guilty of drunkenness, regulating purveyors of liquor time as well. These are specifically quotes from Washington. He says, rather, and no enemy, it is said, to the bottle, and by report is addicted to drinking. These are various things he said, again about individuals he wasn't terribly happy with. Benefits arising from moderate use of liquor have been experienced by all armies and are not disputed. So he knew that allowing the guys to let loose a little bit was good for morale, but still led to major problems, and probably the biggest one, and it's one of the most important events in his military career, was the Battle of Trenton. And at the Battle of Trenton, you'll recall the very famous Delaware, where they sneaked on Christmas Eve across the Delaware River and made landfall on the opposite shore and engaged their foe quite by surprise. They won the Battle of Trenton. Upon raiding the camp, the Patriots found 40 hogsheads of rum. Now, hogsheads are large. We're talking about 53 gallons per hogshead. So it's a lot. That's a lot of rum. Now, Washington said, you absolutely do not get to drink that. He ordered it be dumped. Several of his men, on the other hand, chose to indulge, became excessively drunk. And as the story goes, there are myths that are involved in it. But the myth has been that the Hessian soldiers at Trenton were sleepy and drunk and or hungover from a long night of drinking with Washington's men. And it wasn't the Hessians who were inebriated before the battle. In fact, it was the Patriots afterwards that caused the problem. In fact, it was problematic that it was one to have to hurry his drunken and wobbly troops back to Pennsylvania's side with prisoners of war in tow. Intended progress because he was again trying to progress. He was trying to move through Trenton. And he had to, after winning the battle, go right back to where he came from. So again, these are problems that he's encountering with alcohol abuse. Basically, it's his men. Though he was not always so, as we've seen before, and usually it's in times of dire straits. For example, another in history and war, which was in Washington, and he gave them a gill of whiskey or rum to each soldier following the winter of 1778. A gill is about 4 ounces or so. This is what a gill looks like. These are actually pewter gills on this Mount Vernon, which quite, really quite nice of him. It was quite generous of him, I should say, at the time. For a guy who tried to mitigate alcohol consumption amongst his men. But I mean, this is dire straits. A lot of these guys probably aren't going to survive the winter. And it's almost basically kind of this idea that these daily rations that he started giving out of a gill of rum were kind of like bottled courage for these guys to get through it. He also tried to have his soldiers drink it diluted. And he avoided taking the whole ration in one single gulp himself to try to get them to string it out. Of course, some would take it in full slugs, as you can probably imagine. But nonetheless, it's interesting to watch him play this game, right, with alcohol amongst his men. Now, to get to the topic of beer, though, finally, right? I've been going on and on about spirits and spirit consumption and production amongst Washington and his men. Remember that when he leaves for war in 1775, he will not see Mount Vernon for 6 years. Now, during that time, Mount Vernon was put under the guise or the control of Lund Washington, his cousin. And this is a snapshot. You've been to Mount Vernon, have seen this. It's absolutely beautiful place. It's a really awesome national park. You get out there, check it out. It's huge, just sweeping estate. But you see the gardens here in the foreground, and Lund was in charge of deciding basically what would be grown where, or at least implementing what General Washington wanted grown instead. While I was doing research back in, in 2018, I spent quite a bit of time in Virginia. I spent some summer trip out last year doing some extended research on the topic. I did have the wonderful opportunity to see the brand new research institute for George Washington at Mount Vernon. This is the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George. When I was there, it was only 3 years old. So it's quite beautiful, and the archives are unbelievable there. And I do mean unbelievable. Not only is it gated, and every day I'd go there, I had to say who I was there to meet, even though they kept seeing me come back each day. I still had to tell them who I was and what librarian I was working with. They're bringing into this little research area. And then if you look at the back corner, it's kind of like off left center images there. A little, yeah, here's my pointer. So that door back there, you go back in there, it's a vaulted room. Basically go into a vault, out of a vault, and you can see and handle all of these documents from the Washingtonian era. Many of them were written by George or his family. And they have this massive collection that's still being cataloged back there. Now, I was able to do quite a bit of research, and as you'll see on the next couple of slides, these are pictures with my camera, or camera on my phone. I was allowed to do that, but I can't until I ask for permission to publish these. I can't print copies yet. But I was curious about what was going on with Lund during those 6 years, basically what he's doing at the estate to either make beer or bring in beer, whatever it might be. Well, within the archives were references to it. This is an invoice. That's, again, the shadow of my phone that you can see, referencing a Tierce beer. Now, luckily, again, another one of our colleagues in the field, Teresa McCullough, who runs the beer project for the Smithsonian Beer History Project, she was able to look this up for me, and it's actually a measurement. It's 42 gallons, by the way, if you're curious. It's a weird British measurement. We're talking about the bringing in of beer to the estate. But the one that I found probably most interesting was this letter from Lund to his cousin. You'll notice on the left-hand side, it says, "To His Excellency George Washington." And it's crazy handling these things. I mean, as a classicist, I've handled a lot of ancient artifacts that are thousands of years old, but I'll tell you, it's really crazy holding something that George Washington handled or wrote himself. And this letter was quite odd to me, and I spent a lot of time looking at it because it had been cataloged as an agricultural letter. They had to do with the clear cutting of forest, basically, or at least the clearing out of a field, I should say, not forest, for the production of something agricultural. And it would have been filed under hogs, that they thought they were going to, it seemed like it was being turned into a hog lot or a place for hogs to graze. Backside of the letter, this calligraphy, like I said, sometimes can be hard to read. We zoom in on the second side, you'll notice that actually what they were doing was removing tobacco. You actually see references to it here, to grow hops. And hop comes in several times in the letter, and down here underlined, as I have for you, is for the purpose of making beer. This is really cool. I shared this with the head librarian, the botanist on site, and they're like, well, you should come back out and keep doing research, because we don't even grow hops at Mount Vernon because we didn't know he grew any. So it seems that there may have been hops being grown on the estate for beer production. More on that to come as I get back out there to do research, hopefully later this year if this pandemic stuff all lifts eventually. Now, of course, GW was heavily involved in Yorktown in the battle there, and eventually the war is going to come to an end. Treaty of Paris takes place in 1783, and things, we launch ourselves into early America. Now, in early America, and I'm going to shift gears a bit and jump ahead a little bit to kind of wind this down to open it up for questions. One of the big things for George in his later years was visiting some of his brethren from the First Continental Congress, as well as the founders of the Americas, and one, or I should say founder of the United States. And one of his contingents was Benjamin Franklin. Now, Ben Franklin was well on in his years at this point. He was by far the eldest of the men involved in the formulation of our early colonies, early Constitution, and the United States in general. And he was quite fond of beer, so fond, in fact, that when Washington made his obligatory trip to visit old Ben in 1787, Washington's first courtesy call was to Franklin, and as Chernow states in his biography, quote, his elderly host broke open a cask of dark beer to receive him. We actually know Ben Franklin was a huge fan of porter and dark beer. He loved it. Now, Washington, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was diving into it off the bat, but we do know that he cured porter. Porter seems to have been his beer of choice. Now, maybe this was instilled by Ben Franklin. Maybe it was just instilled by the people drinking in this area at that time. Porter was a very common beer in the late 1800s, but again, there aren't that many. So not many people are producing it yet in the States. But he started to contemplate this idea of the business of alcohol production and consumption. He eventually turned to a man we know quite well these days, especially because of the musical Hamilton. And Hamilton was really the guy that kind of got the wheels a turning for Washington. He learned from this younger man who, if you read much into this period. It's really quite interesting. Hamilton and Washington had a very rocky relationship. It was very much a love-hate relationship. It was very good in the beginning. They hated each other for a period of time, and then towards the end, they kind of became colleagues again. But what Hamilton argued was that the nation was in dire economic straits following the Revolutionary War, and they needed to find a way to make more money. And so he was a big proponent of producing alcohol. At the same time, though, I will say he was the one that proposed an excise tax on distilled spirits. And this will lead to the Whiskey Rebellion later on that Thomas Jefferson's going to have to deal with. A topic for a different time, a different conversation. But nonetheless, it did production. And Hamilton was a big proponent of it. There were grist mills that were popping up all over the place in the early colonies. And they then would use these to eventually start distilling spirits. And as I said, this would eventually lead to the Whiskey Rebellion. The whiskey producers didn't necessarily like being taxed on their commodities. Now, Washington won't retire until 1797 after the term president. Between terms, he had come to for an extended stay. And he would soon start making malt. He started to distill, and he also would start brewing. And the maltster, brewer, and kind of the process proceeded. At the same time, though, the people that he was appointing to do these things, he would constantly chastise. It was a guy by the name of John Christian Ehlers, who was the caretaker of the estate, but Washington was upset with him all the time because he was drunk all the time, and therefore he saw him as lazy. He was making alcohol, but he was drinking a lot of it. Here, the very famous 16-sided barn at Mount Vernon, very cool construction, more on that a different time as well. But it did eventually lead to him building his own grist mill at Mount Vernon. Here, fully reconstructed on the foundations of the original structure as well. Here are just a couple of videos of it running. Like I said, this has all been reconstructed directly on the site. It's really, really cool. When I was out there a couple of years ago, they were making grits with it. It's all water turned, really quite phenomenal. It's built exact scale using the exact same materials as well. So he first opens up his grist mill, of course, to make food source, but shortly thereafter, he realized that there was a lot to be had in using this for distillation. And so he starts doing that, and he builds his distillery in 1797, the first year of his of his retirement. Now, when he did that as well, he also, like I said, he's got to kind of learn the trade, but also there's a lot of money to be made from it. And what's really phenomenal, I can't give more thanks to this man. If you were following me on Instagram, you saw me post a picture of Steve. This is Steve Bashore, Steve, head distiller at Mount Vernon, and he is making the whiskey just like GW and his crew did back in the day. That's what he's mixing. He's open time with and I over the few days, gives behind the scenes access to Mount Vernon, which was really phenomenal. And it's really, honestly, really quite nice. It's really good whiskey. They've won a lot. Right? I'm just going to move in the interest of time. But that being said, in the industrialization of whiskey for George Washington, by 1799, reportedly, he was actually producing just a tremendous amount. Much so, in fact, that he put 5 copper stills in, which are all in there. They have 5 copper stills within the distillery now. And he was producing 11,000 annually, the largest whiskey producer in Virginia at the time. So it was just booming what was coming out of there. Now, in regards to what he was drinking, well, he drank all kinds of things retirement. There are some really wonderful stories about him late in life. One of my favorite ones is that at a private party that he hosted on August 27th of 1789, he reportedly drank a pint of beer and 3 glasses of wine at dinner. Demeanor, quote, became increasingly more lively, as I'm sure it would for all of us. But it also brings us to that topic of George Washington's teeth. And you see them here. These are the remains of his dentures, the one best known set that is the election of Mount Vernon. Why do they look the way they do? Well, there are a couple of things. One, it's actually a very bleak reality of the period. These teeth they have been presumed, actually analysis has shown that some are probably of animal bone, the vast majority are human teeth. And those teeth were taken from slaves. And that is one of the harsh realities of this period. One thing that I always have to remind myself when I do this study is that it's very interesting and honestly difficult at times to respect someone as much as you do, knowing the things that they did. And that is a reality of George Washington and his estate that cannot be undone, was that he was a slave owner. Now, when these teeth were extracted is not clear. He had a dentist that kept making these dentures for him. He had terrible teeth, and he went through several sets. When he died, he had no teeth left. But there are, at the same time, in these rough stories, there are comical ones at times too, in order to, we hear that there was a letter indicating Washington's dentures had turned very black upon one visit from his dentist, and it's because he was soaking them in port wine, we think, to kill the bacteria, or he was drinking too much port that was staining them. Now, on December 14th of 1799, Washington would die. At the age of 67, how he died it's not obviously entirely clear. It is perhaps due to working outside in the wet and cold. He had a tracheal inflammation, and he didn't take proper precautions at the time, we're told. He also may have had something called hypovolemic shock due to excessive bloodletting, because at the time it was common to bloodlet when people were ill, and he may have suffered from that. Nonetheless, he passes away. And this is his tomb at Mount Vernon with his wife as well, which can still be visited today. Now, in regards to the beer that was produced there, we do have a recipe from him. This is written in his own hand, a small beer that you see on the left-hand side. What I will tell you about the small beer, though, is many scholars, and I would agree with them, I presume that Washington himself probably never drank this. It is not a very pleasant beer. Many of you maybe on this call or on this webinar have tried to recreate often very little grain and some hops, and it's just basically kind of a very sugary water. We do often feed to slaves. And again, he was a slave owner. 317 slaves lived at Mount Vernon. 123 were owned by George Washington himself. The rest were leased or dowered out. This is a slave quarters on the estate here. It's very possible that that is where that beer was going. At the same time, within the collection at the Fred W. Smith Archives are several books that were owned by General Washington, President Washington, and the family, more often than not by Martha. And in these wonderful accounts of how to brew, how to distillate, here another one, very an excellent book that's got a lot of really cool stuff in it, The Complete Housewife. Because remember, brewing was basically something that women did at this time. Men didn't typically do it. Now, where was he getting his beer? As I said, beer was not common. It was actually quite rare at this time. Well, when he went up to get that beer, to have that porter with Ben Franklin, it's likely that Ben Franklin got that cask of brown ale from Robert Hare. Now, Robert Hare was a well-known brewer in Philadelphia. He was the son of a brewer in England, so he knew the trade well, especially of English porters. And we actually know that Washington was buying some beer from Philadelphia and shipping it down to Mount Vernon. So it's very possible he was getting it from here. It's likely, I would presume, because he was the best known brewer in the area. That's just a plug for my good friend here, Tom Cahill on the right. Tom owns Yards Brewing in Philadelphia. If you haven't got out there to try his Ales of the Revolution, they are awesome. They're not necessarily 100% historic recreations, but he took historic recipes and made these awesome beers for Ben Franklin Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And obviously, as you can tell from Tom on the right, he is a trip. I will tell you that. Damn good friend in the beer industry, and he makes really good beer. So you out to Philly, you got to try it out. But he's big into the history as well of where Washington and some of the other patriots were getting these things. Another place where he was probably buying it, actually we know because of the ledgers, was from.
Hey, Travis, we lost you again. Right when you're starting to talk about Alexandria. While Travis is getting back, I'm just going to remind everyone to start asking questions in the chat room as we start to wrap up.
Sorry, guys, I dropped again. Is everybody still there? Almost done. Let's finish this up. So, as I was saying, you guys heard me say about Wales, right? So Wales, his brewery was a place we know for sure that Washington was buying beer, and it was porter, potentially some other kinds of beer as well. It may have been on this side of the street where the sign is. It may have also been on the other side of the street. There's this large industrial warehouse that's been turned into like restaurants and things now. But it's a really cool blast from the past just to walk by it because it's right out on the shore. This is the coastline, basically right out here of Chesapeake Bay and everything as it comes in, which is really, really cool. And so just really, really neat place, but also was a place that had a darker side to its history. It was one of the large transfer locations for slaves, to be honest, unfortunately. And so Alexandria is well known for being a slave hub at the time. But nonetheless, both of these places were locations that he bought beer. So how was I going to recreate the beer that I am sipping on now and that I did? Well, honestly, there's more research to be done. I wouldn't say this is 100% a recreation, but I'd say it's pretty damn close to what George was drinking. Thank you to Teresa McCullough at the Smithsonian, as well as Joe Hersey, who works there. They've been sending me a lot of really cool stuff, really cool data that hopefully I can continue to build off of for further research and further, hopefully, recreations. But a lot of it also went into the Washington family. I had to see kind of what other people were doing because, again, George wasn't the one typically brewing, right? It's going to be Martha or one of the slaves, most likely, that was brewing at the estate if they were brewing at all. Or even at these other breweries, they had master brewers, but who was actually doing the brewing? Well, I did spend quite a bit of time at Colonial Williamsburg. And there, like I said, Frank Clark, when I was there in March 2016, this is Frank. He's an awesome guy. Again, a part of the cohort of the Chicago Brewseum. I got to brew with him one day and learn a little bit about brewing molasses beer in particular from the time period. Also, when I came back, and hopefully I'll try to mute these. So this is me brewing George Washington Porter. What we did is I basically did an extensive amount of research on exactly what would have been in the beers that Robert Hare was brewing, as well as Andrew Wales, and also learning a little bit more about late 18th century English porter tradition, which they had learned from. So this is me just adding basically some of the specialty malts into the brew, as you can see here. We also, let's go by this. This is just the grain being transferred. Of course, I'm brewing this on a modern brewing system, right? So it's going to, be a little bit different, much larger quantity than he was using at the time. But here we're in the mash. And then eventually, we also did hop it the way he wanted. We use whole corn hops, and I get asked a lot, what hops did you use? Well, I'll tell you probably what he was using was some kind of derivative, or when I say he, I mean Robert Hare, Andrew Wells. They were probably using a derivative of East Kent Goldings at the time because a lot of hops were still being imported for beer production. When I made this beer, the only whole leaf or whole cone hops I could get that were fresh were Cascade. And I thought, well, hell, what's more American than Cascade hops, right? So I put Cascades in it. I will tell you the beer is not particularly hoppy anyway. It's very, very mild, as most English style porters are. Fermentation on it. So we did do oak fermentation just as he would have in a much larger scale, obviously multiple vessels being used here. And then it raged, as you can tell, cranked right along, which was really fun to see. The oak is all Virginia white oak as well, so I tried to stay true to that also. So this is where some of that pricey stuff comes in with the Ales of Antiquity, because sourcing these things can be a little wild at times. Now, in order to finish off the product, I also had to cold condition it because most beer at this time would go into caves. And so we nicely have a cave, right, at the brewery. The beer was held between 40 and 50 degrees. In this instance, it was right around 42 degrees is where it's being held. And I cellared it for the same amount of time that Wales's ledgers show and what Robert Hare's do. We presume it was right around anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, basically. So it hold it in there. And then once it was all done, we have a finished product, and we didn't do anything in the process to change it. Again, let me mute this on the next one. When we debarreled it, we did not filter it. We did not spin it, none of that stuff, because he wouldn't have been able to do that, right? So what I try to do with the Ales of Antiquity is stick as close as I can to the process. And those of you who are on the Nestor's Cup one last month, this is a little different than Nestor's Cup. Nestor's Cup was my very first one. We're now a couple years in, and I try as hard as I can to stick very, very, very close to the process to get as close as I can to what the beer would have tasted like. So we produced George Washington Porter out of it. Obviously, a lot of research went into it as well. You can see I'm literally sitting in this spot right now in my office doing of course, there's a lot of book research that goes into all of these things. But I love the fact that I get to do experimental archaeology and basically take all of these things I've learned and try to employ it in a different way. As a result of all that work, I'm continuing my research. I hope to be back out in Virginia later this year again, as long as all of this pandemic stuff eventually lifts. My research did extend to Monticello, which I'll be talking about next week. That was the newest, that's most recent Ale of Antiquity was Monticello that I released in February of this year here at the beer cellar at Monticello. And then for President's Day next year, I will be releasing James Madison's Montpelier. So excited to be working on this project. Beautiful location and wonderful people to work with at Montpelier. So really, really excited about that. I have to give a thank you to a whole milieu of institutions that I've gotten to work with in these projects, meaning really Mount Vernon or George Washington Porter, as well as Monticello. And then obviously Montpelier will be coming up. So a big tip of the hat to a lot of my friends and colleagues in the field. Mike Stein at Lost Loggers has been awesome. We've always shared information, Teresa at the Smithsonian, and then all of these other institutions as well. As I indicated in my last talk, the next Ale of Antiquity, whenever this pandemic stuff starts to lift, will be Roman Britain. So I've finished all of my research on 2nd century Roman British brewing, meaning brewing by the Roman military along the various walls from the 2nd century. So that will be coming soon. But also just down the road, some other really cool things. My lineup is starting to formulate for 2021. I already indicated James Madison. I have 2 other ones that are almost firmly committed. So probably the next time I talk to you guys, I'll be able to tell you what they are. I don't want to give any, don't want to get people too excited before I can certainly say that for sure I'm doing these, but I will tell you, one is back in Britain again, one that I did not expect to be having the opportunity to do so soon. And the other one is in Sweden. Next week, if you are interested and around, I am doing 2 more talks on different topics. So on Thursday night, May 28th, I will be talking about beer that built the pyramids and talking about Egyptian beer. I'm going back to my mainstay. And that's at 4:30 p.m. So you can find out more about this on my Facebook page or Avery's Facebook page. Next Friday night at 5:30 my time. Well, I should say a lot of you are in different time zones. I'm going to talk in Mountain Time. So in Mountain Time, it'd be 4:30 for the beer that built the pyramids. For May 29th, 5:30 Mountain Time, I will be doing Sipping on History with Ales of Antiquity. I'll be talking about the creation of 1752 IPA and Monticello. If you're looking to follow me, you can follow me on these various things. I tend to be best with Instagram, and I've got it all set up so that it usually posts to my Facebook. So if you're better with Facebook, you can find most of my posts there. But I'm going to go ahead and I'll start taking questions now. And I apologize, I went a little over, Liz. Hopefully that's not too much of a problem and people got to hang out. And sorry for my Wi-Fi issues today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my screen share so I can see you guys. And let's fire away, whatever you guys got.
Not a problem. Everyone's around, and we'll take a few questions here. And as I suspected, first question I see is where, and I asked you this too when we were planning this, so it's kind of funny. Where can people get George Washington Porter?
So that's a great question. I will tell you, and now I'm just going to make you guys all angry at me. I have the last 4-packs in my basement. So, but that doesn't mean we won't make it again, because I will tell you that of the 10 ales of antiquity we've done since 2016, George Washington was by far the best seller. It kind of blew us away. It was the first canned ale of antiquity, and we sold out in 10 weeks. So it's a bit limited now, but there are some things in the works for me to start recreating some of these older ones. I'll tell you that were only available at the tap room, and making them available for larger distribution. So just stay tuned. As you can imagine, with the pandemic, it put a lot of stuff on hold that were just trucking right along like juggernauts. And we thought a lot of stuff was going to be happening this summer. And things are just slowing down a little bit right now, but just stay tuned. I think they will be available at some point.
Travis, it's curious, when you told me that the Porter had been the most popular of the 10 that you've done, do you think that's because both the individual and the style are the most well known for people in the United States compared to, these other curious brews you're making?
Yeah, I do think that's it. I think that, as strange as I don't even think it sounds strange. I think you put George Washington on something and it triggers something with people, especially if it has to do with history, right? I never was terribly interested in American history throughout most of my collegiate career, right? As you can tell from what I teach. But as I dove more into beer history and just becoming more of a historian, it's like definitely got a soft spot in my heart, and it's become my pet project. And I think anytime you see those new publications that come out about George Washington, that grabs your attention. And I think that's part of it, just having George Washington on there. It's very recognizable for people. But I do think you're right. I think Porter, right? Porter triggers a lot of things for people. And what I think is so fascinating about that is a lot of people don't even know what the hell a porter is, right? There's all this controversy in history that we could go on for hours talking about the difference between stouts and porters and when that fissure occurred and all the history that's woven into it. Highly recommend reading stuff by Martin Cornell on that. Martin Cornell is a beer historian in England. He writes awesome stuff on this transition, and he's a wonderful man. If you ever get a chance to meet him, he's just a sweet person. But he, I think I do think it triggers something. Like when to my point about last month, when I talk about Nestor's Cup, that had a soft spot in my heart because I really wanted to prove that the Greeks made beer. But a lot of people don't even know who the hell the Mycenaeans are, right? And so I'm talking about something that's so foreign. This is not foreign. I think I've been quite surprised by a lot of people in the UK who are very interested in George Washington Porter. I had this wonderful couple who came to Avery about a year ago, and they were visiting from the UK, and they took a 4-pack of George Washington Porter back to the UK with them. And every historic location they go to that's affiliated with the Washington family, they put the George Washington Porter next to it, take a picture, and send me a picture of it. You know, so I think George Washington has this, he has this effect, you know, that a lot of other people don't. So yeah.
From Kevin, did Washington have a yeast culture, or did they use wild open fermentation? And how did you approach the yeast to pitch?
Wonderful question. So I could not culture anything that I knew specifically from Mount Vernon itself. So what I tried to do in order to replicate this was, we do know with Robert Hare that the original ale yeast that was brought into the Philadelphia breweries came from England, likely from London. And so I did, if you guys are familiar, I'm sure many of you are if you're home brewers, we use 1028. So why use 1028, which is English ale? And it's a fairly historic strain according to Y Yeast. It does date back a couple centuries. And then by putting it itself into oak, obviously we're going to get wild cultures in there. Now, that being said, there's the caveat, right? I do have Virginia white oak, but we're in Colorado. So I'm going to get wild stuff in there from Colorado. And this is where, and I'm not ashamed to say it, I tell everybody, when I try to recreate these beers, I do the best I can to, quote, recreate it. But he obviously wasn't going to have any weird, wild stuff growing in those barrels from Colorado, right? When they get out here. What I will say about it is it's surprisingly, it's got a light oak character to it. I don't know how well you guys can see it on the camera, but it's a nice brown color, but can you guys see it's got a little, it's kind of clear. You know what I mean? It's got kind of a reddish hue to it. And it's always had that. It's been a little bit more red in color. Now, early on when we canned it, it was a little hazier. You know, obviously there's a little bit more yeast in suspension. But in terms of the wild, funky stuff, it didn't really take off. And I think that's because we did the, quote, cave conditioning. Like I read in all the documents, that as soon as they would finish fermentation in oak, bung it, throw it in the caves or throw it in a cold area for an extended period of time. Now, the one caveat to that as well, though, is I don't know exactly what the temperature was in those cold conditions that they were maintaining. At Mount Vernon, in the records I found, actually at Monticello, I found several records about cave conditioning at Mount Vernon at the Monticello archives. They tended to hold it between 40 and about 58 degrees, somewhere in that ballpark. But of course, we all know how hot it can get in Virginia in the summers. And so I don't really know how well they were able to maintain those cooler temps in the cellaring conditions.
We're going to take one last question that's coming via Facebook.
Sure.
After the Revolution, were hops typically imported from England at the time or other places like Germany, given anti-English sentiment and preferences, etc.?
Yeah, so fantastic question. We do know that they were still being imported from the Brits. Now, in regards to the German piece, that's a great question I can't answer yet. What I'm trying to figure out, because of the Hessian connection, so since the Hessians were fighting on our side, if you will, on the American side, there is obviously a German contact or connection there. What I can't find yet is any firm documentation of German importation of hops. I suspect it was going on, but I can't verify it yet. So hopefully more to come on that down the road.
Okay, since we've gone over, I'm going to wrap this up right now. One last question that I have for you, Travis, is
yes.
George Washington Porter might not be available, but are any of the other ales of antiquity?
Yes, they are. So I have 2 ales of antiquity currently available. Now, again, because of the pandemic, I don't think they're outside of Colorado at the moment. But, you know, hopefully we can find a way to change that once things open back up. I have 2 ales of antiquity that are currently available. 1752 India Pale Ale, which is what I did for that is spent about a year doing research on the original IPA, basically just trying to figure out the tradition of it. I will tell you that is the craziest ale of antiquity we've made, because the process that beer went through to get to India, I actually replicated it. We literally shook the barrels 4 weeks to mimic transport on water. We fluctuated the temperatures between 40 degrees and 85 degrees multiple times to hit the equator, Cape of Good Hope, all that kind of stuff. So that's available. And I will tell you, I thought that beer was going to taste, there are no kids on here, like shit. I thought it was going to be terrible. There were days where we were tasting the barrels and I damn near cried because I'm like, I can't believe how much money I just wasted. But it turned out pretty damn good. So that one is available. Released that in November. And actually what I think is quite fun about it is now that it's getting a little older, it's actually getting even more true to style because a lot of that stuff would sit in India for a really long time before it was consumed. The other one I have out is Monticello. And so I made a beer, like I wasn't planning on doing this presidential series as extensively as I have, but it's going to go on for a while. I'm also working on Andrew Jackson. I know people don't like Andrew. I don't either. He was a terrible president. But there's some really interesting stuff in Nashville that I'm working on. I'm also working on Teddy Roosevelt right now. So I'm going to continue the series on the presidents. But Monticello, that beer, I'm really quite proud of it because it is not a beer. It was a beer made for Thomas Jefferson. I made the beer for the people who made that beer. And we actually know the slaves that brewed beer at Thomas Jefferson's estate. So this is a tip of the hat to them.
All right. Well, there you have it. Travis, thanks so much, as always, for being a part of our team and sharing all of your extensive knowledge and keep doing the work that you're doing and enhancing what we're drinking. Appreciate that. Thanks to everyone who joined us. We, like I said, are going to keep doing this. Tomorrow, actually, is our next event. The Museum is all about beer history and culture around the world at different time periods. And tomorrow, we're going a little bit more modern and talking about everyone's favorite elixir, Malort, and the new anti-hero Malort that was literally just released today. So I'll be having a chat with Tremaine, who owns CH Distillery and makes Malort, and Josh Deeth, who is a founder of Revolution and is also on our National Advisory Board. So if you guys are into Malort and Revolution Brewing, please join us tomorrow. And we have a slew of other things happening, again, throughout the rest of the month. So just keep checking our website. If you subscribe to our newsletter, you always get first bit of information there as well. So thank you again for joining us and for your constant support. And once again, Travis, thank you.
My
Hope
pleasure.
everyone has a awesome Memorial Day weekend at home. And we'll see you again soon.
Excellent. Thank you again, guys. Take care. Have a good weekend.